The night Hope learned the truth about Liam's secret was the night everything in her world shattered beyond repair, because what she overheard was not a misunderstanding, not a rumor twisted by jealousy, but a confession spoken in a trembling voice that carried the weight of betrayal. And as she stood outside the office door, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might burst through her chest, she realized that the man she had trusted with her life, with her child, with every fragile piece of her belief in forever, had been living a double reality, one that threatened not only her marriage but the very safety and stability of their family. And in that moment something inside her shifted from shock to icy clarity. Liam had kept a secret so explosive, so unforgivable, that staying would mean accepting a future built on deception. The revelation came in fragments at first, scattered phrases about hidden meetings, manipulated documents, and a partnership that put their child at risk. But as the pieces fell into place she understood that Liam had been entangled in something far darker than an emotional betrayal. He had been working behind the scenes with people who wanted leverage over their family, using confidential information connected to Thomas's business dealings, all while pretending to be the moral center of her universe, and the duplicity cut deeper than any romantic scandal ever could. When Liam finally saw her standing there, pale and silent, he knew the facade had crumbled, and the excuses began spilling out in a rush. He had done it to protect her, to secure their future, to prevent a larger catastrophe, but every justification only confirmed that he had chosen secrecy over trust, manipulation over partnership, and Hope felt the ground of Los Angeles, the city she had called home her entire life, turn into a stage set that could be dismantled overnight. She walked away before he could finish, because staying long enough to hear more lies would have broken her completely, and she drove through the glittering streets with tears blurring the neon lights, thinking of her child asleep at home, innocent and unaware that the foundation of their family had cracked open. It was Thomas she called, not because it was simple or safe, but because in that moment he was the only person who understood both the business war Liam had ignited and the emotional devastation Hope was enduring. And when he answered, his voice steady yet edged with concern, she felt the first flicker of stability in hours. Thomas had his own complicated history with her, layered with longing, mistakes, and redemption, but he had never pretended to be something he wasn't. He had fought for her openly, flawed yet transparent, and as she explained what she had discovered, the calculated alliances, the hidden leverage, the risk to their child's security, Thomas's silence carried a protective fury that Liam's frantic apologies never had. By the time dawn painted the sky in muted gold, Hope had made a decision that would alter every trajectory of her life. She would not allow her child to grow up in the shadow of secrets and corporate schemes, and if that meant leaving behind the mansion, the memories, and the familiar skyline of LA, then so be it. Thomas didn't hesitate when she told him she needed help. He began outlining practical steps with a calm precision that steadied her trembling resolve: secure the necessary documents, transfer funds discreetly, arrange temporary housing somewhere far from the reach of Liam's influence and the relentless gossip of the fashion world. The plan unfolded rapidly, fueled by adrenaline and heartbreak, and when Hope returned home to pack, she felt like a stranger moving through rooms filled with echoes of a life that no longer existed, folding tiny clothes into suitcases while fighting waves of grief for the marriage she had believed in. Liam tried to intercept her, his voice raw, insisting that exposure was imminent anyway, that the truth would blow over, that running would only make things worse, but Hope saw through the panic to the underlying truth. He was afraid of losing control, afraid of being publicly exposed, afraid of the narrative shifting beyond his grasp, and for the first time she understood that love had blinded her to the patterns of manipulation woven through their history. When she told him goodbye, it was not shouted or theatrical, it was quiet and resolute, a final acknowledgement that the man she married had become someone she could not recognize, and as she carried their child out into the bright California morning, the finality of the act settled over her like a cloak. Thomas met her at a discreet location away from prying eyes, and the tenderness with which he took the bags from her hands spoke louder than any declaration, because this was not about triumph or rivalry, it was about stepping into a new reality forged by necessity. The news of Liam's secret began to ripple through their social circle even before they left the city limits. Whispers of exposed emails, leaked contracts, and compromised loyalties spread like wildfire, and within hours the narrative of Liam exposed dominated conversations, but Hope refused to check her phone, refused to let the spectacle distract her from the singular priority of protecting her child. As the miles stretched between them and Los Angeles, the skyline shrinking in the rearview mirror, Hope felt both terror and liberation, because leaving meant uncertainty, yet it also meant reclaiming agency over her own story. Thomas drove with unwavering focus, occasionally glancing at her as if to ensure she hadn't changed her mind, but there was no hesitation left in her eyes. The shock had burned away, replaced by a fierce determination that surprised even her. She knew the move would be labeled drastic, impulsive, even reckless, yet she also knew that staying would have required a far greater compromise of her integrity, and integrity was the one inheritance she was determined to give her child. They chose a destination deliberately distant from the epicenter of their former lives, a quiet coastal town where anonymity was possible and the constant scrutiny of high society would not suffocate every step, and as they crossed state lines, Hope allowed herself to imagine mornings without tension, evenings without suspicion, a life measured not by boardroom battles but by the simple rhythm of family. Meanwhile, back in LA, Liam faced the consequences of exposure alone. The allies he had trusted distanced themselves, statements were issued, damage control strategies deployed, but none of it could repair the personal devastation that mattered most, and the image of Hope walking away replayed in his mind with relentless clarity. He had believed he could manage every variable, orchestrate outcomes behind closed doors, but he had underestimated the cost of secrecy on a woman who valued honesty above all, and now that miscalculation had rewritten his future. For Hope, the days that followed were a blur of adjustments, finding schools, setting up a modest home, creating routines that felt grounded rather than performative, and through it all Thomas remained present without pressure, supportive without expectation, proving through action rather than promises that he understood the gravity of what she had sacrificed. Their shared history added complexity to every glance and conversation, yet there was also a sense of second chances unfolding organically. The cold certainty that trust had been irreparably broken, and that memory anchored her resolve. She refused to romanticize the past or minimize the breach. She acknowledged the love that had existed while accepting that love alone could not survive deception of that magnitude. As weeks turned into months, the scandal in LA evolved into legal proceedings and corporate shakeups, yet the physical distance insulated her from the daily turbulence, allowing her to focus on building something sustainable rather than reacting to chaos. Thomas gradually integrated into their new life in ways that felt natural, helping with homework, cooking dinners, sharing quiet conversations on the porch after their child had fallen asleep, and with each shared responsibility, the foundation of trust between them strengthened. Hope was cautious, mindful of the lessons learned, but she also recognized that running had not been an act of escape alone. It had been a declaration that her child's emotional safety would never again be collateral damage in someone else's ambition. The move had indeed changed everything, friendships redefined, reputations reshaped, alliances reconsidered, and yet amid the upheaval there was a profound simplicity in waking each morning without dread. She sometimes wondered whether Liam understood the full impact of his choices, whether he realized that the true bombshell was not the public exposure but the private fracture that had driven her away, and though part of her would always carry the ache of what might have been, she no longer allowed that ache to dictate her direction. The goodbye to LA had not been just geographic, it had been symbolic, a farewell to a version of herself who tolerated uncertainty in the name of love, and in its place emerged a woman willing to dismantle her own life to protect what mattered most. In time, whispers of reconciliation attempts reached her, messages routed through mutual acquaintances suggesting regret, promises of transparency, vows of change, but Hope had learned that words without sustained action were merely echoes, and she chose silence over reopening wounds. Instead, she invested her energy in cultivating stability, in nurturing a home where laughter returned gradually, cautiously, yet genuinely. Thomas, aware of the delicate balance, never pushed her to define their relationship prematurely. He understood that trust rebuilt slowly, like a structure reinforced beam by beam, and his patience became one of the most compelling arguments for a future together. There were moments of vulnerability when Hope admitted her fear of repeating patterns, of mistaking intensity for security, and Thomas listened without defensiveness, acknowledging his own past mistakes and articulating the growth he had fought to achieve. That mutual honesty became the cornerstone of their evolving bond, starkly contrasting with the secrecy that had unraveled her marriage. As seasons shifted and the initial shock of their disappearance faded into a quieter narrative of reinvention, Hope realized that running had not been about fleeing scandal but about reclaiming authorship over her life, about demonstrating to her child that courage sometimes looks like leaving rather than staying. The world they had left behind continued spinning, headlines replaced by new controversies, but in their coastal haven the air felt clearer, unburdened by expectation. Hope would watch her child play on the beach, laughter carried by the wind, and feel a swell of gratitude for the instinct that propelled her into motion the night everything fell apart. Liam's secret had detonated like a bomb in the center of her marriage, yet from the rubble emerged a path she might never have considered otherwise, one marked by resilience, partnership, and the radical decision to prioritize truth over comfort. And though the future remained unwritten, as all futures do, Hope no longer feared the unknown the way she once had, because she had already survived the worst revelation imaginable and discovered within herself the strength to walk away, to say goodbye to a city and a life that no longer aligned with her values, and to step forward with Thomas into a chapter defined not by scandal or secrecy but by the deliberate, daily choice to build something honest from the ground up. The first time Hope allowed herself to truly exhale was not the day they signed the lease on the small white house overlooking the restless gray-blue ocean, nor the afternoon she watched their child race across the unfamiliar shoreline with laughter that sounded miraculously untouched by the chaos they had fled, but weeks later, on an ordinary morning when the sunlight filtered through linen curtains and she realized she had slept through the night without jolting awake from dreams of whispered confessions and slammed doors in Los Angeles, it was then she understood that survival had quietly shifted into something closer to healing. Yet even in that fragile calm, the aftershocks of Liam's exposure continued to ripple outward, because secrets of that magnitude do not collapse neatly, they unravel networks, topple alliances, and leave behind questions that refuse to remain buried. Back in the city they had left behind, legal analysts debated the implications of the leaked documents, business rivals recalibrated strategies, and society pages that once celebrated glamorous events now dissected the implosion of a marriage once touted as unbreakable. But Hope refused to let the spectacle reclaim her emotional energy. She had made a conscious decision that the narrative of Liam exposed would not define her child's future, and every choice she made reinforced that boundary. Thomas, for his part, balanced distance and involvement with careful precision, splitting time between managing the professional fallout remotely and ensuring that when he was present in their new coastal town, he was fully present, not distracted by endless calls or corporate maneuvering. He understood that this chapter required more than grand gestures, it required consistency, school pickups, grocery runs, repairing a leaky faucet, listening when Hope's confidence wavered in the quiet hours after dusk. Their relationship evolved not through dramatic declarations but through accumulated evidence of reliability, and that evidence mattered more to Hope than any impassioned vow ever could. Still, peace did not arrive without complication. There were moments when the weight of what she had done, walking away from a marriage, uprooting her child, severing ties with a city that had shaped her identity, pressed heavily against her conscience, and in those moments doubt whispered insidious questions: had she acted too quickly? Could transparency and therapy have salvaged what was broken? Was escape a form of strength or simply another reaction to betrayal? She would replay the night of Liam's confession in her mind, examining each word, each tremor in his voice, reminding herself that it had not been a singular mistake but a pattern of calculated concealment that shattered trust. The secret had not only involved corporate scheming, it had involved leveraging information connected to Thomas in ways that could have placed their child in the crossfire of public and financial retaliation. It had been strategic, prolonged, intentional. And when doubt grew loud, she anchored herself in that clarity. Trust, once eroded by sustained deception, cannot be restored by apologies alone. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, Liam faced the slow, grinding consequences of exposure. Investors distanced themselves. Former allies offered carefully worded statements that expressed disappointment while quietly protecting their own interests. Interviews were requested and declined. The narrative had shifted from shock to scrutiny, and for the first time in years, Liam found himself without the leverage he once wielded so confidently. Yet what unsettled him most was not the professional damage, it was the silence from Hope. He had expected anger, negotiations, perhaps even ultimatums. He had not expected disappearance. Her absence was not dramatic, it was absolute. No retaliatory interviews. No public condemnations. Just a clean severance that left him alone with the echo of his choices. He told himself she would return once the chaos settled, that she needed space, that the life they built could not be dismantled so completely, but as weeks passed and the legal correspondence shifted from crisis management to structured separation, even his practiced optimism began to fracture. In the quiet coastal town, anonymity became both shield and test. Without the validation of high-profile events or the familiar architecture of status, Hope confronted herself more honestly than she ever had. Who was she beyond the roles of wife, heiress, public figure? What did she want her child to remember about these years? She began volunteering at a local community center, not for publicity, no one there knew her past, but because routine service grounded her in something tangible. She reconnected with creative work she had long neglected, sketching designs late at night at the kitchen table, rediscovering a part of herself that had existed before marriage negotiations and corporate entanglements. Thomas noticed the shift immediately. There was a lightness returning to her movements, a spark of independent ambition that had nothing to do with him or with Liam. He encouraged it without trying to co-opt it, understanding that if their relationship was to survive long-term, it needed to stand beside her growth, not overshadow it. Their child adapted more quickly than either adult had dared hope. Children, Hope realized, measure security not by geography but by emotional climate. When tension dissipated, when raised voices were replaced by calm explanations and consistent routines, resilience bloomed. There were questions, of course, about why they no longer lived in the big house, about why certain faces no longer appeared at dinner, but Hope answered with age-appropriate honesty, careful never to vilify Liam yet refusing to fabricate illusions. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that change things, she would say gently. Our job is to make sure we choose what keeps us safe and loved. And in those conversations, she felt the full weight and privilege of motherhood, shaping not just circumstance but understanding. Thomas and Hope's partnership deepened gradually into something unmistakably intimate again, though neither rushed to define it publicly. They had learned, painfully, that labels mean little without integrity beneath them. Instead, they focused on shared values, transparency, accountability, mutual respect. They attended counseling together preemptively, not because they were in crisis but because they wanted tools to navigate future conflict differently than before. It was an unconventional step, yet one that underscored how profoundly Liam's secret had altered their perspective. Secrets thrive in silence, strength grows in confrontation. And so they chose confrontation, of fears, of expectations, of unresolved history, over complacency. But the past has a way of resurfacing when least convenient. Nearly 6 months after their departure, a formal request arrived. Liam wanted joint custody discussions initiated immediately. It was not unexpected, yet the finality of seeing it in legal language sent a tremor through Hope's hard-won stability. She had never intended to erase him from their child's life. She had intended to establish boundaries. Now those boundaries would be tested in courtrooms rather than conversations. Thomas offered unwavering support but made it clear that the decision-making authority belonged to Hope. This isn't about winning, he reminded her one evening as they sat watching the tide roll in. It's about what creates the healthiest environment long-term. His restraint, his refusal to turn this situation into a rivalry, reinforced why she had trusted him in the first place. The custody proceedings unfolded with the measured pace of legal machinery, far removed from the tabloid frenzy that had once accompanied their names. Evaluations were conducted. Financial disclosures examined. Character references submitted. Throughout it all, Hope maintained composure rooted not in vengeance but in principle. She did not seek to punish Liam, she sought assurance that transparency would no longer be optional in decisions affecting their child. Liam, for his part, appeared chastened, stripped of the arrogance that had once characterized his strategic maneuvers. In mediated sessions, he admitted that fear, of losing influence, of losing relevance, of losing her, had driven choices he convinced himself were protective rather than manipulative. It was not a full absolution, nor did Hope offer one, but it was the first time he articulated responsibility without deflection. As negotiations progressed, a structured arrangement emerged: shared custody with clearly defined communication protocols, financial safeguards, and third-party oversight regarding any business dealings that could indirectly impact their child. It was clinical, almost impersonal, yet perhaps that impersonality was necessary. Emotion had proven unreliable currency in the past. When the agreement was finalized, Hope felt neither triumph nor defeat, only a sober acknowledgement that this was the new architecture of their family. The fairy tale had dissolved, replaced by a blueprint grounded in realism. In the months that followed, supervised transitions gradually gave way to more relaxed visitations. Liam traveled to the coastal town rather than demanding relocation, a concession that did not go unnoticed. He seemed changed, not dramatically transformed, but quieter, more deliberate. Whether that change would endure remained uncertain, yet Hope no longer felt responsible for managing his evolution. Her responsibility was narrower and clearer now: protect, nurture, model integrity. Thomas remained